One cold night in Lochdu, Sonsie refuses to come inside, and Hamish Macbeth senses something is wrong. What seems like a small worry soon leads to a quiet but unsettling mystery. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy settling into these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. Only 11% are subscribed while 89% aren't. Your support truly means a lot. Hamish Macbeth first noticed the change in the air long before he reached the police station. The evening mist had thickened in that slow, creeping way it sometimes did along Loch Dubh, as though the loch were breathing out a long sigh and refusing to take it back. The water lay flat and grey behind him, not a ripple in sight, as if even the fish were unsettled. The cold sharpened against his cheeks, and the faint smell of peat smoke drifted from chimneys where villagers were shutting in early, the way they always did when bad weather or bad gossip had begun to stir. Luggs trotted ahead with unusual purpose, his ears angled forward, tail held stiff. Hamish, hands tucked deep in his pockets, quickened his stride a little. The dog wasn't one for needless fussing, and Hamish had learned long ago that Luggs sensed things before anyone else did, especially him. Hamish almost smiled at the thought. It was a comfort, having one creature in his life who noticed changes without making a speech about them. They rounded the bend towards the station, its familiar squat frame emerging from the fog like something half forgotten. The windows glimmered faintly with the last weak light of dusk. Hamish was thinking only of a pot of tea and a quiet hour by the peat fire when Luggs stopped dead. His low growl travelled through the mist in a way that raised the short red hairs at the back of Hamish's neck. Then Hamish saw it. Sonsie, that great hulking cat who usually treated the outdoors as a regrettable necessity, sat rigidly on the doorstep. Not lounging, not grooming, not blinking in his usual disdainful way. Sitting like a carved figure, tail wrapped tightly round him, staring into the trees beyond the path. His coat bristled along his spine, and his pupils were wide in the dim light. Even from several yards away, Hamish could see the tension in the animal's muscles. "That's strange behaviour from you," Hamish murmured, keeping his voice light, though he felt a faint tightening in his chest. "You're the one who usually pushes past me to get in first." Sonsie didn't blink. He didn't even flick an ear. He kept staring into the tree line as if the shadows themselves had grown teeth. Hamish crouched beside him, extending a hand, but Sonsie shifted only enough to let Hamish know he had no intentions of going indoors. Luggs inched closer, sniffing the air with quick, sharp breaths. A soft whine rose in his throat. All right, Hamish said quietly, standing again. "No need to panic, the both of us." But he didn't like it. The animals never behaved like this unless something was amiss. And Hamish had learned more from animals over the years than from most official briefings from Strathbane. He let himself into the station, leaving the door ajar in case Sonsie changed his mind. The interior felt colder than he expected, as though the fire had died down too quickly. He hung his coat on its usual peg, gave the old kettle a shake and reached for the telephone to check messages. The line crackled so badly that he hardly recognised Patel's voice at first. "Hamish? I said, something odd's been happening down by the loch path. Lights last night. Flickering, like somebody shining a torch, but too steady for that. I don't want to alarm the tourists, you can, but—" The line dissolved into static. Hamish replaced the receiver gently. Patel didn't rouse easily, especially not with talk that would put off paying customers. If he'd called about strange lights, it wouldn't be idle fancy. Hamish poured himself a cup of tea and drank most of it before he slipped the torn notebook page into his pocket for safekeeping, then stepped back outside. Sonsie was still there, still glaring into the dark beyond the trees. A deep rumble rolled in his throat. "Oh, stop terrifying the poor dog," Hamish muttered. But Luggs stayed tight against his leg regardless. He decided to make a short round of the village while some daylight remained. The mist had thickened, yet faint silhouettes of cottages still showed their warm rectangles of light. The smell of stew drifted from one open window. Someone clattered dishes in another. Hamish nodded to Jessie Curry, who was dragging her dustbin closer to the road despite the fog. "You're out late for a change," she said, squinting at him. "I suppose someone's been stealing hens again." "Not that I've heard," he replied. "Aye, well, something's going on," Jessie sniffed. "Morag McIver swore she heard a shout by the Kirk path earlier, and the new fellow at the hotel's been asking questions about the Crofters, as if he has any business with them." Hamish had learned long ago that village gossip came pre-salted, but rarely without a kernel of truth. He thanked her, got a suspicious glance in return, and made his way further down the road. By the time he'd checked the post office, Patel's shop, and the pier, the fog had grown so thick he could see only a few yards ahead. People had shuttered their windows early, murmuring about weather and unwelcome noises. A couple of tourists hurried past him toward the hotel, their bright jackets at odds with the grey evening. He saw nothing unusual, nothing that Sonsie might find threatening. But he felt it, that faint prickling of the skin that told him the village had already noticed something before he had. Loch Dubh had a strange intelligence to it, an instinct that lived in its houses, its hills, its gossip. Hamish returned to the station, lugs sticking close to his leg. Sonsie hadn't moved or settled. The cat blinked once as Hamish approached, then resumed his rigid stare. Hamish followed the direction of Sonsie's gaze. The tree line at the back of the station blurred in the fog, but he could see a faint disturbance in the ground where the grass sloped into the trees. He walked closer, boots sinking slightly into the wet soil. Footprints, not clear but unmistakable. Someone had been standing there, watching either the station or the path leading to it. The drizzle had softened the edges, but not enough to disguise the intention. Lugs growled low in his throat and then barked sharply. The sound bounced against the trees. Hamish froze. A branch snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but sharply enough to slice through the fog like a whispered warning. Something moved in the shadows, not a large shape, but quick. Hamish stepped forward instinctively before slowing again. There was no sense charging blindly into fog. That was Blair's sort of stupidity. He stood still, listening. Silence. Then the faint drip of moisture from branches overhead. Nothing more. "Hush, boy," he said softly to Lugs, though his own heartbeat felt uncomfortably loud. Whoever it was is long gone. But he wasn't sure of that. He crouched to examine the prints for a moment longer, noting the depth, made by someone heavier than a child, lighter than Blair. The stride was close, as though the person had been standing in one place more than walking. When he straightened up, Sonsie was now beside him, tail low, eyes fixed on the trees. Even with Hamish close, the cat didn't relax. They returned to the station together. Hamish coaxed the cat again, earning only an indignant flick of the tail. He built up the peat fire, fed Lugs, and checked the locks. But the unease lingered like damp in the stone walls. Someone had been there, someone who didn't want to be seen. And Sonsie, who usually couldn't care less about the affairs of humans, had known it first. Hamish sat by the fire, the warmth barely touching the cold in his thoughts. Outside, the mist thickened to the point where the loch vanished entirely, absorbed into the night. He glanced toward the door, half expecting a knock, half hoping there wouldn't be one. More often than not, trouble in Loch Dubh began quietly, with something small and unsettling. And this, Sonsie refusing shelter, the footprints, the snapped branch, was the smallest start of all. Hamish leaned down to scratch Lugs behind the ears. "Well, lad," he murmured, "it looks like we're in for something." And the peat fire crackled softly in agreement as the mist pressed closer against the windows. The thin sunlight of morning crept over Loch Dubh in a weak, apologetic way, as if it regretted having to disturb the mist that still clung stubbornly to the grass. The rain from the night before had left everything slick and shining. Hamish Macbeth stepped out of the station with Lugs at his heel, the dog already sniffing the air with a restlessness that Hamish noticed at once. Lugs had barely eaten his breakfast, which was never a good sign. Sonsie had disappeared somewhere behind the station, refusing once again to come indoors. Hamish didn't push it. Animals knew their own minds. He shut the door gently and tugged his jacket tighter. The cold seemed to rise from the earth itself, settling into the bones of the village. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, drifting low and slow. It was the kind of morning when sound carried strangely, sharp in some places, swallowed in others. Hamish walked the familiar path toward the kirk. It was the start of his usual rounds, though he already felt that nothing about the day would be usual. Lugs stopped twice to sniff patches of grass, tail stiff, ears pricked. Hamish bent briefly to rub the dog's head. "I know, lad. You're not yourself this morning." The words came out in his quiet Highland lilt, gentle and understated. He'd never been one for dramatics, but he listened carefully to silence and to animals. Both often told him more than any official report from Strathbane. At the bend near the kirk, he saw Mrs. Wellington waving both arms as if she were trying to flag down a distant ship. Her pale face stood out starkly against the dark stone of the kirk wall. She was a tidy woman, always wrapped up tight in her wool coat, her hair curled carefully every morning. Today it hung slightly limp, as though she had run her hands through it one too many times. "Constable Macbeth, over here at once!" Hamish felt a tightening in his stomach. He walked quickly toward her, and Lugs trotted ahead, nose to the ground. The moment he reached her side, Mrs. Wellington pointed a trembling finger toward the grass at the base of the wall. There, half hidden by a tipped wheelbarrow, lay the crumpled form of a man. Hamish knelt immediately, though he already had the sinking certainty that there was nothing to be done. The man's face was tilted slightly toward the kirk, eyes frozen wide in a look of pure shock. No blood, no bruising, just a twisted ankle and a terrible stillness. "It's Angus Meldrum," Mrs. Wellington whispered, as though saying the name too loudly might wake the dead. "I nearly tripped over him. I was bringing flowers for the communion table and, well, there he was." Hamish studied Angus's features. The crofter had always looked half suspicious of the world, even in life. A prickly, solitary man, known more for his feuds than his friendships. He had quarrelled with neighbours over peat cutting, with fishermen over boat spaces, with tourists over noise. And now here he lay, as though the village itself had finally exhausted him. Hamish stood slowly, brushing damp from his knees. Lugs sniffed around the wheelbarrow, then gave a soft growl. Hamish followed the dog's line of attention and noticed the moss near the wall had been disturbed. A cigarette stub lay half embedded in the wet earth. Not Angus's brand. He smoked rough little roll-ups that left crumbs everywhere. Hamish crouched again, lifting the stub with care. The print on the paper was faint but visible, a brand sold mainly in cities. Odd. Angus rarely left Lochdoub, and when he did, it was only to the crofters' marts or to Inverness once a year to buy boots. Boot prints marked the damp soil in a wandering, uneasy line. 2 sets, he guessed, though the drizzle had softened their clarity. Angus's old soles left a distinctive drag. The other prints were sharper and narrower. Someone else had been here. By now, villagers had begun to gather at the edge of the grass, forming small knots of worry and speculation. Jessie Curry stood clutching her cardigan as if the news might fly out of it. Her sister Nessie hovered close by, their combined expressions sharp enough to cut Pete. "I told you there was a shout last night," Jessie whispered loudly enough for half the village to hear. "And didn't I say that Angus was out late again? I heard him tramping about past 10. "That's nothing," Nessie countered. "He was seen arguing with those tourists from the camper van yesterday afternoon, loud enough to wake the hens." Behind them, a fisherman muttered to another. He'd been fussing about sheep going missing, claimed someone was lifting them for sport. "Sport? Sheep? You ken Angus." Hamish let the voices wash over him, his mind sorting through small details, impressions, contradictions. This was how he worked best, quietly, gently, without making a show of authority. He asked a few soft questions here and there, nodding at answers, letting people talk themselves into revealing more than they meant. Crofters could be blunt, villagers sharp, tourists defensive. Everyone had their own rhythm. He was bending again to study the moss, when the sound he dreaded shattered the stillness, the grinding, sputtering roar of a Strathbane police car. Blair. Inspector Blair stormed out of the vehicle like a man convinced the world owed him applause. Anderson scurried behind him, nodding eagerly as if Blair's footsteps were holy ground. Blair straightened his coat, glared at the cluster of villagers, then turned his full, unpleasant attention to Hamish. "What have you bungled this time, Macbeth? Couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Hamish rose, keeping his expression mild. "I was on my rounds, sir. Mrs. Wellington found the body." "I didn't ask for excuses," Blair snapped. He stomped closer to Angus's body, hunched like a vulture. "Well, he's dead. That much even you can see." Mrs. Wellington's face flushed with indignation, but Hamish gave her a subtle shake of the head. No need to start a battle she couldn't win. Blair jabbed a finger toward Hamish. "You'll step back from this investigation. Daviot wants this tidied up quickly. Heart failure, accident, whatever fits the paperwork. And for once in your miserable career, try not to make trouble." Anderson nodded vigorously. "Yes, Constable, don't interfere." Hamish felt a flicker of dry amusement. Strathbane, with all its fluorescent-lit bureaucracy, always believed the fastest solution was the best. He knew better. But there was no point in arguing. He simply murmured, "Aye, sir," in a tone Blair would mistake for obedience. As Blair strutted around the Kirk wall, Hamish drifted toward Patel, who had arrived with a bag of vegetables under one arm. "Terrible thing," Patel whispered, "but I'll tell you something, Hamish. Angus was in my shop late yesterday, bought tinned soup, bread rolls, matches, more than he usually takes, looked nervous. I thought he'd seen a ghost." "Did he say out?" "Only that he expected a long night," another villager chimed in. "He was muttering about strangers lurking by the loch. Said someone had been watching him." Hamish tucked the cigarette stub into his pocket, his mind already working quietly. He made no grand declarations, no dramatic vows. He simply began to walk the perimeter of the kirkyard, noting boot marks, broken twigs, the faint dent of something heavy being dropped or dragged. Blair shouted something behind him, but Hamish pretended he hadn't heard. Lugs followed him closely, occasionally pausing to sniff the air. The dog's posture was tense, alert, as though the morning carried more than just dampness. When Hamish finally returned to the station that evening, the mist had thickened again. Sonsie sat in the same place as before, refusing to cross the threshold. His tail twitched once, sharply. Hamish stood beside him, staring into the trees behind the station. The prints were almost washed away now, but he remembered the shapes clearly. Someone had been there, and the village had noticed, whether by footprints or by tongues. As the fog folded around Lochdoub like an old blanket, Hamish felt in his bones that Angus Meldrum's death was far from simple, and far from over. The drizzle had settled into a steady, whispering fall that blurred the edges of Lochdoub and turned the village into a soft grey painting. The loch itself lay dull and still, its surface rippling only when a stray breeze crossed from the moors. Hamish Macbeth walked along the narrow road toward the crofts, Lugs close at his heel. The dog kept glancing behind them, as though expecting someone to emerge from the mist. Hamish felt the same tension humming through him. Not sharp, not fearful, just that Highland instinct that something was off-kilter. He tugged his jacket tighter. "It's a miserable day, lad," he murmured. Lugs flicked an ear without breaking stride. The village felt unusually subdued. A few windows glowed faintly with morning lamplight, though it was past 10. A crofter's dog barked once somewhere far off, then went silent. The cold seeped into Hamish's fingers. It was a day for tea, fires, and staying indoors, but he had too many threads to pull. Angus Meldrum's death lay over Lochdoub like another layer of mist. The villagers were torn between fear and curiosity, the mixture that always loosened tongues while keeping secrets carefully guarded. Hamish's first stop was Morag MacIvor's croft, her stone house crouched against the wind, slate roof shining with damp. Smoke drifted from the chimney, carrying a faint smell of burnt porridge. Morag herself stood by the gate, scarf knotted under her chin, arms crossed in a way that signalled both readiness and defence. "Morning, Morag," Hamish said gently. She didn't uncross her arms. "A bad business, Hamish. I suppose you're looking to blame me for it?" "No one's blaming anyone yet." He paused, studying her face. Morag had always been quick-tempered, but this morning her complexion held a greyish tint, and her eyes darted to the side. "Angus accused you of taking his peat," Hamish said quietly. Morag's chin jerked up. "I never touched the man's peat or anything else of his. He was daft enough to leave it out uncovered half the time. And he came pounding on my door last week, shouting like the devil himself. I told him I'd thank him to keep his voice down. I've neighbours, you ken." Her voice trembled on the last words. Morag wasn't a woman who trembled easily. Lug stepped forward, sniffing her boots, then let out a low, uneasy growl. Morag wrung the ends of her scarf. "That dog's always had it in for me." "He's only unsettled," Hamish said, though he felt the flicker of unease tighten again. Dogs had strong feelings about guilt, fear, and secrets, even if they couldn't tell them apart. "You didn't happen to see anyone near Angus's place 2 nights ago?" Hamish asked. Morag hesitated. "I saw a lantern moving near the old sheep pens, thought it was Angus up to something foolish again. He was a man who courted trouble with both hands." Hamish filed that away. "Thank you, Morag." She turned quickly toward her door, relief clear in the hunch of her shoulders. Lugs watched her go, letting out one final low rumble. Hamish made for the harbour next. The drizzle thickened over the water, and the boats looked like half-drawn sketches. Ewan Fraser was coiling rope on the pier, his movements quick and efficient. He was a neat young man, always pressed and tidy despite the weather, with a soft-spoken nature that softened even more when confronted with authority. "Ewan," Hamish called. The young man straightened at once. "Constable, terrible news about Angus." "It is. You saw him recently?" Ewan's fingers twitched on the coil of rope. "Aye, yesterday evening, near the jetty. He was arguing with a stranger." Hamish's interest sharpened. "What sort of stranger?" "Well-dressed. City coat, long and dark. Tall man, walked with purpose." Ewan wet his lips nervously. "I thought he was a tourist at first, but tourists don't usually glare at folk like that." "What were they arguing about?" "I couldn't hear all of it above the gulls, but Angus shouted something about keeping away from the croft and 'I've nothing left for you.' The stranger didn't shout, just spoke in this low, tight voice." Lugg stepped forward to sniff Ewan's trousers. Then, for the first time that morning, the dog sat quietly. Hamish felt a small easing of tension. Lugg's was an excellent judge of character. "Did Angus seem afraid?" Hamish asked. Ewan nodded slowly. "More angry than frightened, but his hands shook when he walked away." Hamish thanked him and continued along the harbour, his mind tugging at these threads. A stranger in a city coat, Angus's fear, Morag's trembling indignation, footprints washed by rain, all half-clues and all tangled. As he approached the hotel, he saw the tourist couple sitting outside their camper van, drinking instant coffee from plastic mugs. The woman wore a blue anorak, her hair frizzed by the damp. The man wore a wool cap pulled low. Their tyres were coated thick with mud. Both looked up sharply as Hamish approached, Lugs trotting beside him. "Oh dear," the woman said at once. "We're not in trouble, are we? We haven't parked illegally." "No," Hamish replied mildly. "I'm just asking about your argument with Angus Meldrum." The man bristled. "Argument? He threatened us. Came storming up to the van, shouting about noise and pollution and destroying the peace. We were only boiling water." "He said tourists were ruining Loch Dubh," the woman added. "Said we should take our noisy contraption elsewhere. We didn't know he had a heart condition." Hamish watched their faces, two mixtures of defensiveness and mild guilt. Outsiders always grew twitchy in the face of Highland tragedy. Lugs sniffed their boots and immediately stepped back, growling lightly. "We didn't touch him," the man said quickly. "We just told him to mind his own business. He stomped off after that." Hamish nodded and left them to their coffee. Their nervousness came more from being outsiders in a small village than from guilt, but Lug's discomfort told him the encounter hadn't been simple. His last visit was to the Kirk office. Reverend McPhee answered the knock with his usual anxious expression, spectacles perched at the end of his nose. "Constable Macbeth, I was expecting you." He stepped aside to let Hamish and Lugs in. The office smelled of damp paper and lavender polish. "You saw Angus 2 nights ago," Hamish said. The Reverend folded his hands, a gesture both pious and nervous. "He came asking about repentance. He was troubled, Hamish. Spoke of old sins catching up to a man. I told him the Kirk offered comfort, but he seemed beyond comfort. Said he needed to put something right but feared the consequences." "Did he mention anyone specifically?" "No one by name. Only spoke of a shadow from his past." Lug circled once before settling at Hamish's feet, ears tilted forward. Hamish thanked the Reverend and stepped outside again. The drizzle had deepened into a fine, lingering mist that softened the world into greys. Sonsie wandered across the road, pausing to sniff the air before circling a patch of ground with careful steps. He avoided stepping directly on it, tail flicking sharply. Hamish crouched, touching the damp soil. Nothing visible. But the cats and dogs of Loch Dubh rarely avoided patches of earth for no reason. By evening the fog rolled in thick as wool. Windows glowed faintly along the village streets. People walked quickly, shoulders hunched, eager to get indoors. Hamish moved slowly toward the station, Lugs at his side, Sonsie following at a distance. The mist curled around the lampposts and drifted across the loch in billowing folds. Blair had spent the afternoon barking up the wrong tree, insisting the tourists were guilty of something, anything, that could be written neatly in a report. Davitt had telephoned, demanding clarity, and Anderson had nodded along to everything Blair said. Hamish had only murmured, "Aye, sir," in his quiet way, which Blair mistook for incompetence. Returning home, Hamish felt a quiet certainty settle inside him. Loch Dubh's truths always came muddled with gossip. People lied too easily, not out of malice but habit, sometimes fear, sometimes guilt. The village protected its own, yet also hid from its own in equal measure. He lit his peat fire, its smoke curling through the room like a comforting presence. Lugs stretched near the hearth. Sonsie finally pushed the door open, but only far enough to sit just inside, watching the window as if expecting someone to pass by. Hamish sat in his old chair, stared into the flames for a long moment, and allowed himself one small, dry thought. This is no simple matter. The fire crackled in muted agreement as the fog pressed close around the station. The wind swept across the moors in long, low breaths, carrying with it the faint scent of heather and a promise of rain that had not yet fallen. Hamish Macbeth walked the narrow path toward Angus Meldrum's croft, his long frame bent slightly against the cold. The sky above was a dull wash of grey, heavy with quiet threat. The sort of sky that made even a man who disliked paperwork wish he were warming himself beside a peat fire rather than trudging into another mystery. Lugs padded beside him, nose twitching, ears tipped forward as though the moors themselves muttered something only a dog could hear. Hamish gave a soft pat to the dog's head, more for his own comfort than for Lugs, who seemed far more certain of things than Hamish felt this morning. The croft appeared gradually through the mist, small, squat, weathered, and clinging to the land like a stubborn barnacle. Angus had always kept it just on the right side of habitable. Now, without the man alive to fuss over it, the place looked abandoned enough to stir a quiet ache in Hamish's chest. Loneliness recognized loneliness. He pushed the door open. It groaned in a way Hamish found oddly fitting. The interior smelled of smoke gone cold and damp wool. Open tins lay on the counter, beans, soup, and something unidentifiable. The kettle on the stove had been scorched, black along the base, as if Angus had forgotten it entirely. Papers lay scattered across a small table, some damp from the draught creeping through a cracked pane. Lugs sniffed with quick, sharp breaths, then moved toward the back of the hut. His tail stiffened. "Aye, all right," Hamish murmured. "We'll see what set you off." He moved slowly to the table first, picking up the torn notebook lying open among crumbs of oatcake. Angus's handwriting had never been tidy, but these entries were worse, hurried, jagged, a man writing with his nerves rather than his hand. The watcher came again, a page later. "Saw him by the burn. Did he see me? Not sure. Don't trust my eyes any more." And then, "Debt unpaid. He'll come. I know he will." Hamish felt a faint tightening in his chest. The words carried fear, old fear churning up again. Angus Meldrum had been a quarrelsome man, quick to argue, but he was not easily frightened. Whatever he had written here had unnerved him deeply. Lugs let out a low growl near the back door. Hamish stepped over, the boards creaking beneath his feet. The growl wasn't aggressive, it was warning. Hamish knew the difference. He crouched, brushing aside a loose mat to reveal a faint gap in the floorboards. A trap door. He pried it open with his fingertips, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary. Below lay bottles of whiskey. Not illegal, nothing fancy, but quite a lot of them. Enough to raise questions about trading, debts, favours. Angus had always been a man who dealt privately when he could. That in itself was not unusual, but the combination of whiskey, a burned kettle, open tins, and frantic notes suggested a man waiting for something, or someone, with dread. Hamish noticed something wedged between two bottles, a page torn sharply from the notebook. He eased it out. "He says I owe him still. Inverness was a long time ago. He'll not leave it." The handwriting faltered at the bottom as though Angus had been interrupted. Hamish replaced the trapdoor gently. He stood, taking in the small, cluttered hut, the place of a man who had lived alone for decades, harbouring grudges and secrets that no one had coaxed from him. In Lochdub, such men were both pitied and ignored, until they died. He stepped back outside. The wind had picked up. The moors whispered in that unsettling way that made every distant movement seem purposeful. On the walk back, Hamish sorted the clues in his quiet, understated way. Angus had feared someone from Inverness. He had debts, real or imagined. He had been watching someone even as he felt watched. His fear had grown enough to keep him awake and burning kettles dry, yet it didn't feel like the whole story. Hamish felt that small, familiar tug in his mind, the instinct that told him there were threads here connected to Loughdub itself, not just Inverness. By the time he reached the village, the drizzle had begun again. The streets were slick, the shop windows fogged from the warm air inside. Patel stood outside his shop restocking a display of onions. He brightened when he saw Hamish, though the brightness dimmed quickly when the constable drew near with that quiet, thoughtful look he always wore when collecting gossip. "You've been at Angus's croft, have you?" Patel asked, lowering his voice instinctively. "Aye," Hamish said. "I found some things." Patel gave a hesitant glance up and down the street, though there were no tourists nearby, only old Mrs. Morrison dragging her shopping trolley like a weary horse and the minister speaking to a fisherman. "Angus was strange last week," Patel said quietly. "Came into the shop near closing, whispering, looking over his shoulder every 2 minutes. Said someone was coming back after many years. He asked whether anyone had been asking for him. I told him no. He still seemed frightened." Hamish nodded. "Did he say who?" "No names, just that he'd wronged the wrong man." "And when was this?" 3 nights ago, maybe 4. Hamish thanked him and stepped into the road again. Lugs padded alongside, shaking drizzle from his coat. The dog's ears twitched in every direction, as though gossip itself made sound waves only he could hear. Hamish made for Morag MacIvor's croft next, not to accuse her, but because fear made people confess things they wouldn't otherwise say. Morag opened the door with her usual frown. "What is it now, Hamish? You've already asked me everything under the sun." "Aye, but you've not told me everything," he said gently. Morag bristled, but Hamish held her gaze with the calm patience the villagers trusted. Eventually she sighed, her shoulders sagging. "All right. Angus has been frightened for weeks, jumping at shadows. He asked me once if I'd seen a tall man near the old pens. I told him no, but that didn't stop him staring out his windows half the night." "Did he say why?" She hesitated, rubbing her hands along the sides of her skirt. "He said something about Inverness, something he'd done, said the past would catch him yet." Hamish left her doorway with the weight of her words clinging to him like damp wool. His final stop was the Loughdub Hotel. The receptionist, a newly arrived girl with a tight bun and sharper eyes than most tourists realised, nodded politely as Hamish approached. "Did anyone ask after Angus Meldrum recently?" Hamish asked. She blinked. "Yes, actually. A man. Tall, dark city coat. Looked like he'd stepped off a train from Edinburgh. He wanted to know if Angus stayed here often. I told him Angus wasn't the type." Hamish felt a small shift in his chest. Not triumph, just the faint click of another piece falling into place. "Did he give his name?" Hamish asked. "No, he was polite enough, but there was something off about him." Hamish thanked her and stepped outside. Evening was rolling in behind a thick curtain of rain. The jetty creaked under the pressure of wind and water. Hamish walked along it slowly, thinking best with the cold pushing against him. Angus had feared someone, possibly someone from Inverness, but the notebook's talk of the Watcher felt like someone closer, someone already here. As Hamish reached the station, the rain thickened to a steady drumming. Sonsie sat on the doorstep like a carved guardian, refusing once again to enter. His eyes followed Hamish with wary intensity, then flicked toward the trees behind the station. Lugs growled softly, the sound low and uneasy. Hamish stood still for a moment, letting the cold air fill his lungs. Another thread tugged in the mystery, subtle, quiet, unmistakable. "Something's coming," he murmured. The rain answered with a steady hiss. The morning broke with a brittle, slate-coloured light that did nothing to warm Loughdub. Mist hung low along the loch's edge, curling around the jetty posts like cold fingers reluctant to let go. Hamish Macbeth walked toward the Kirk Hall with Lugs trotting close, the dog's tail held low and alert. A damp wind carried the smell of peat smoke, old stone, and the faint tang of fish from the harbour. It was the kind of weather that pried at old memories and encouraged gossip to sprout like weeds. Hamish had woken early, his mind stirring with loose threads from Angus Meldrum's life, threads that tugged in too many directions. The villagers had begun talking before the sun rose, their voices wafting through open windows and drifting across garden gates. Loughdub had turned its attention to the dead crofter the way it always did, with sharp tongues and a peculiar sense of duty. As Hamish approached the Kirk Hall, he paused a moment, letting the cold air settle in his lungs. Lugs sniffed at the ground, then nudged Hamish's leg with a worried huff. "I ken, lad," Hamish murmured. "It'll be a long morning." Inside, the hall buzzed with subdued agitation. The wooden beams overhead trapped the smell of damp coats and boiled cabbage. Mrs. Wellington stood near the front, fussing with hymn sheets even though there would be no service. Several fishermen hunched around a table, their voices rising and falling like the tide. The Curry sisters hovered at the back, whispering with bright, eager eyes. The atmosphere was close, thick with the weight of long-held grudges. Hamish slipped quietly to the side, listening as he always did. Listening was his best weapon. People tended to forget he was a policeman when he didn't speak. "I'm telling ye, he sabotaged the nets again," one fisherman announced. "Ruined a whole morning's work. Did it out of spite, he did." "Nonsense," another shot back. "Angus wouldn't have climbed into your boat unless there was whiskey waiting at the other end." "Exactly," a third muttered. "Which there never is." Hamish moved closer. "Morning, gentlemen." The men stiffened, then attempted polite smiles. Fishermen in Lochdoub might squabble among themselves, but they treated Hamish with a wary respect. "You'll not be believing everything folks say about Angus, will you?" the first fisherman asked, scratching his beard. "I've learned not to take gossip at face value," Hamish said mildly. "But I do listen." Mrs. Wellington cleared her throat dramatically from the front. "If we could all calm down," she declared. "We're here to discuss the matter sensibly." Jessie Curry muttered loudly enough for half the room to hear. "Sensible? In this village?" Hamish fought a faint smile. Reverend McPhee stepped forward, hands clasped, the picture of mild distress. "Brothers and sisters, we must remember Angus Meldrum as a soul in need of peace, however quarrelsome he may have been. But I cannae deny, he was troubled. He came to me a week ago speaking about revelations." A murmur rippled through the hall. "What sort of revelations?" Hamish asked quietly. McPhee blinked behind his spectacles. He feared something from his past would come to light, something he did long ago. He mentioned a winter he'd spent in Inverness working for a regrettable employer. This caused another stir. The Curry sisters leaned in eagerly. "Oh, he would have done," Nessie murmured, "always disappearing, always skulking." Before Hamish could press further, the door burst open with a slam that rattled the windows. Inspector Blair strode in, coat flapping like a disgruntled crow. Anderson trailed after him, nodding enthusiastically before Blair even spoke. "Well, well," Blair announced, puffing out his chest. "A village meeting without your betters, how touching. Macbeth, up to your usual uselessness?" Hamish kept his face blank. That always annoyed Blair more than any retort. "We're discussing Angus Meldrum," Hamish replied calmly. Blair snorted. "There's nothing to discuss, I've got my man." And before Hamish could stop him, Blair pointed a triumphantly grubby finger toward the door. "Ewan Fraser, arrest him." Ewan, who had just stepped inside with his cap dripping rainwater, froze like a rabbit caught in a torch beam. Colour drained from his face. "Me?" he squeaked. "What did I do?" "You argued with the dead man," Blair barked. "That's all I need. Anderson, cuff him." Anderson fumbled with his handcuffs, nearly dropping them as he hurried forward. Hamish stepped in quietly, placing a long arm between Ewan and the inspector. "Now, sir, Ewan's hardly the violent sort." "He looks guilty," Blair shouted. "He always looks guilty," someone muttered. Hamish glanced at Ewan, who stood trembling, his shoulders hunched. The hall was silent now, every villager watching with their own blend of fear, triumph, or disbelief. "Let me speak with him first," Hamish said, calmly. Blair glared, but Daviot's name loomed large over his ambitions. 5 minutes, he snapped, and then he's mine. Hamish guided Ewan outside, lugs trotting beside them. Rain had begun again, thin, needling drops carried by a restless wind. Ewan's breath fogged in the damp air. "Hamish, I swear I didn't hurt him. I only argued with him. Everyone argued with Angus." "Aye," Hamish said gently. "I ken that. But you saw something, Ewan. You told me before there was a stranger." Ewan swallowed hard. "Aye, and there's something else. I didn't want to say it in front of the whole lot." He reached into his pocket and pulled his hand out empty, fingers shaking. "I saw Angus pass something to someone, down by the jetty. Looked like a wee wooden box. Not big. The stranger took it." "When was this?" "Night before he died." Hamish felt the faint shift of dread inside him again. "And you didn't recognize the stranger?" No. Tall, city coat, walked away quick as anything. Hamish nodded. Thank you, Ewan. I'll take it from here. But Blair? I'll deal with Blair, Hamish said quietly. He returned to the Kirk Hall, allowing Blair to crow about having a suspect, but when the inspector demanded to take Ewan away, Hamish feigned a mild incompetence Blair always expected. Sir, the paperwork's not done. If you take him now and Daviot asks for forms— Blair's face contorted. Paperwork was his weakness. Fine. I'll let you finish your pathetic scribblings, but I want him before nightfall. Hamish nodded, hiding the small victory behind a polite expression. Once Blair stormed out, the hall broke into buzzing voices again. Old grudges against Angus sprouted in every direction. Accusations about stolen peat, stolen sheep, stolen hearts. Morag glared at anyone who hinted at her sister's name. Fishermen swore Angus had cursed their nets. The Crofts whispered that Angus had cheated them in some old deal. Hamish let the noise wash over him until a faint tug from Lugs pulled him back to the present. The dog's nose pressed against the floor near the doorway. He sniffed, then let out a sharp, insistent bark. "Show me," Hamish murmured. Outside, Lugs followed a scent through the soft mud, weaving behind the hall, then toward the edge of the moors where the old sheep pens stood in disrepair. The prints were faint but visible, 2 sets moving quickly. Hamish crouched, studying them. "Not Angus," he said softly, "and not Ewan." Sonsie appeared suddenly at the edge of the slope, a dark shape against the pale mist. The cat sat perfectly still, tail curled around him, golden eyes fixed in the same direction as Lugs's snout. "Something's out there," Hamish murmured. Behind him, voices drifted from the hall, accusations, fear, bitter pride. But here, at the edge of the moorland, the clues felt clearer, the air colder. Hamish stood slowly, the dread settling deeper. Angus Meldrum had stirred too many grudges in too small a village, and now someone had begun moving through Lochdoub with purpose. The wind shifted. Lugs growled. Sonsie did not move. The next step in the mystery waited in the fog. The storm came in fast from the west, swallowing the sky in a heaving mass of black clouds that pressed low over Lochdoub. By mid-afternoon, the village lay wrapped in a rattling curtain of rain that hammered the roofs and sent water streaming down every gutter. Hamish Macbeth stood at the window of the police station, watching the sheets of rain sweep across the loch in wild, slanting strokes. The wind moaned down the chimney, rattling the peat fire. It was a day for tea and staying put, but Lochdoub rarely respected Hamish's preferences. Lugs lay close to the fire, head on his paws, but not asleep. His ears twitched at every gust. Sonsie sat under the small overhang outside, fur slicked damp, tail curled tight around him as if he refused to abandon his post guarding the door. Hamish poured himself another cup of tea. The poor phone line crackled uselessly whenever he tried the receiver, reminding him once again that, in bad weather, Lochdoub existed as its own wee island in the Highlands. Strathbane couldn't interfere if it tried, though they'd surely find a way when the storm ended. A flash of movement through the downpour caught Hamish's eye. A figure, coat flapping, head bowed, moved briskly across the road toward Patel's shop. The stranger's shoes shone oddly through the gloom, polished in a way no sensible Highlander would bother with. Hamish narrowed his eyes. Even from a distance he sensed the stiffness and urgency of a man who didn't belong here. A moment later the station door burst open and Patel rushed inside without knocking, dripping all over the floor. "Hamish, there's a man, an odd fellow, just came in. Asked about Angus Meldrum. Too interested, if you ask me." Hamish set down his tea. "Aye? What sort of odd?" Patel wrung water from his sleeves. "City shoes. City voice. Too polite. Said he's a relative. I didn't believe a word." Lugs sprang up, alert. Sonsie hissed softly from outside. That was enough for Hamish. He followed Patel back across the road, rain stinging his face, coat plastered against his lanky frame. Inside the shop, the bell jangled weakly above the door. A man stood at the counter, middle-aged, tall, with dark hair combed neatly back. His coat dripped water onto the floor, but he held himself with the stiff composure of someone used to better surroundings. His jaw was tight. His eyes darted from Patel to the shelves to Hamish, never lingering long. "Constable," the man said with a smooth, clipped accent, "I believe we should speak." Hamish gave a small nod. "Aye, we should. And you are?" "Gavin Muir, He extended a hand as if expecting Hamish to shake it. Hamish didn't. The hand dropped. "I'm here about my cousin, Angus Meldrum." Patel made a quiet noise that sounded suspiciously like a snort into a paper bag. Hamish kept his tone mild. "And what brings you to Loch-Dubh in such weather?" "I only arrived back an hour ago," Muir said. "I heard unfortunate news. I came to see his home, to settle any remaining family concerns." Luggs moved to Hamish's side, staring at Muir with a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated through the shop floor. Sonsie, visible through the doorway, flattened his ears. Hamish observed the man's stiff shoulders, the way he stood slightly angled, not defensive but wary. "Cousin, you say? Angus never mentioned family in Inverness." "There are things," Muir replied, jaw tightening, "men do not speak of." Hamish gave a soft grunt. "Aye, that's true enough." He gestured for Muir to follow him toward the shelves of tinned goods, where privacy came easily among sacks of flour and jars of pickled beetroot. Hamish stood with one shoulder against the green-painted wall, casual as if discussing weather. "You ken Angus fell out with many folk," Hamish said. Muir's eyes sharpened. "I'm aware of Angus's temperament." "You kept in touch?" "No." A faint muscle ticked in Muir's cheek. "We had a falling out 20 years ago, over money." "Yours or his?" "His debt," Muir said curtly. "My money." Hamish studied him for a moment. "And you've come here now. Why? To settle accounts?" Patel, pretending to reorganize the tea shelf, tilted one ear to listen. Muir's voice dropped. "He had something of ours, something he took when he fled Inverness. A small wooden box that belonged to our uncle. My family wants it returned." "What was in it?" "Nothing valuable. Sentimental only." But Muir's jaw tightened again. Hamish allowed silence to fill the space, a technique that made even the stubborn talk. Outside, thunder rolled across the loch. Finally Muir added, "I thought Angus would have kept it. I assumed I might retrieve it from his croft." "You said sentimental," Hamish murmured. "It is. Folk don't chase sentimental things through storms." For the first time, Muir's polished composure cracked just slightly. "The box matters to my mother. She's ill. She wanted it returned. That's all." Hamish didn't believe him entirely, but he also didn't sense violence from the man, only desperation, pride bruised by time, and the strain of unfinished business. He nodded politely. "I'll speak with you later. For now, stay warm at the hotel." Muir gave a stiff nod and left the shop, the bell jangling again. Patel exhaled loudly. "He's lying, Hamish. I don't like the look of him." "Aye," Hamish said, rubbing Luggs's ears to calm the dog, "but lies come in many sizes." Outside, Sonsie slunk closer, fur damp, eyes narrowed as he watched the stranger disappear into the curtain of rain. The cat's tail lashed once. Even the village animals disapproved of Gavin Muir. Hamish walked back to the station through a steady downpour. The wind drove the rain sideways, stinging his face. Every few minutes the power flickered, just enough to dim the lights and remind him how isolated Loch-Dubh became when storms settled in. He brewed another pot of tea, warming his hands around the mug. Luggs paced the room, restless. Sonsie refused to enter, choosing instead to sit at the doorstep like a carved sentinel. Hamish leaned back in his chair, thinking in his quiet, understated way. Muir's story had gaps. Angus had feared someone, a man from Inverness, a watcher, a debt. But Muir didn't feel like a murderer. No hard edge to him, just a brittle pride and a tether to some old grievance. Still, Hamish had learned that fear and guilt could twist even gentlemen into dangerous shapes. As night crept across the storm-dark village, the power flickered again. Shadows jerked across the walls. Outside, the wind howled down the chimney. Luggs barked sharply, charging to the door. Hamish stood at once. "What is it, boy?" A sound came from outside, soft, quick, deliberate. A footstep, a scrape. Hard to tell beneath the roar of rain. Sonsie's snarl rose, low, guttural, unlike anything Hamish had heard from the cat before. Hamish moved toward the window, careful not to cast a clear silhouette. Through the rain-smeared glass he saw nothing but darkness and the ghostly shimmer of water running down the panes. But someone was out there, likely a village eavesdropper, hungry for gossip, listening, lurking. The storm raged, but the sense of another presence cut through it sharply. Hamish rested a hand on Lugs's back to quiet him. "Aye, lad," he whispered. "I hear it too." The village lay swallowed in rain. Gavin Muir was not the only soul stirring in Loch-Dubh tonight. Folk here listened at doors as naturally as they breathed. And Angus Meldrum's shadow had not finished with them yet. The world before dawn always felt slightly unmade, as if Loch-Dubh hovered between sleep and waking, waiting for someone to whisper it into existence. Hamish Macbeth stepped onto the shoreline path with Lugs trotting ahead, the dog's silhouette a small dark smudge against the mist. The air held the cold bite of soaked heather and wet stone. Mist rolled low off the loch, drifting in slow curls that muffled the clink of pebbles underfoot. Hamish pulled his jacket tighter. His breath rose in thin, quick vapour. He hadn't slept well, not with last night's storm rattling the windows, nor with Sonsie pacing outside the station, refusing rest, staring into the dark as if the village itself were up to something. The air still felt charged, as though the storm had left more than rain behind. Luggs stopped suddenly, nose pressed to the ground, his tail lifted, stiff with purpose. "Found something, have you?" Hamish murmured, his voice low and gentle, the way it always became in this quiet hour. The dog moved along the shoreline, past a cluster of rocks slick with damp. Hamish followed, scanning the ground with that careful, unhurried attention that made the villagers trust him, even when they didn't realise he was studying them. Luggs halted at a patch of disturbed earth. The soil there, the pebble-scattered, lake-washed dirt, had been turned recently. Footprints blurred by rain, finger marks maybe, a boot heel. Hamish knelt, brushing aside the top layer with slow strokes. The earth yielded easily. Beneath it lay the edge of something wooden, a box, small, old. The grain darkened by moisture. Hamish lifted it carefully, his fingers brushing along the worn edges. The lid resisted for a moment, then gave with a soft creak. Inside, the faint scent of old paper and dust drifted up. There was only one object inside, a faded photograph. Hamish held it closer, turning toward the dim light growing behind the hills. Two young men stared out from the photograph. Angus Meldrum, beardless and lean, arms slung around another man. A younger Gavin Muir. Both looked uneasy, even in youth, as if friendship had never come easily to them. "So that's you two," Hamish murmured, "before the years spoiled the both of you." Luggs whined, pouring the earth. Hamish tucked the box into his coat just as a gust of cold wind whipped off the loch. The mist shifted, revealing a pale sliver of dawn that cast everything in washed-out grey. It was a scene made for secrets. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of the box. Not heavy, but significant, the way objects tied to old sins always were. As he walked back toward the village, the smell of peat smoke drifted across the moor. Loch-Dubh was waking now. A dog barked. A gate creaked. Somewhere a kettle whistled. Morag MacIver was already in her garden, arms wrapped tightly around herself, though the morning wasn't colder than usual. When she spotted Hamish, she stiffened, clearly torn between inviting him to speak and wishing he'd walk past. Hamish approached gently. "Early start, Morag." She brushed soil from her hands, avoiding his gaze. "Couldn't he sleep? Weather's unsettled." "That's one word for it." Morag exhaled sharply. "You're here about Angus again?" "Aye." A silence hung between them, filled only by the faint bleating of sheep somewhere up the hill. Morag finally lifted her chin. "They met, you ken, Angus and that cousin of his, days before Angus died." Hamish kept his voice soft. "You're sure?" "I saw them behind the old pens. They thought no one watched, but that's foolish in Loch-Dubh. Angus was shouting, said, 'I won't pay again, not this time.' His face—" She swallowed. "He looked hunted." Hamish felt a subtle jolt inside him, that quiet shift when truth nudged aside half-lies. "You didn't tell me this before." "I was scared," Morag admitted, her voice brittle. "Folk might think I had something to do with it, him being, as he was with my sister." Hamish didn't press. Shame and pride were familiar cloaks in Loch-Dubh. Morag had worn both for years. "Thank you," he said softly. She nodded once, then retreated into her small kitchen, shutting the door with gentle finality. Hamish resumed his slow walk through the village. The grey morning had brightened, but only barely. Fishermen pulled on boots and shrugged into heavy coats. A pair of tourists huddled by their camper van, arguing over a soggy map. A dog barked at a passing crow. When Hamish reached the square, he spotted a crowd outside the kirk, Blair in the middle of it, waving his arms as though directing a particularly incompetent orchestra. "There he is," Blair shouted when he saw Hamish. "Macbeth, I've sorted the matter. Those tourists are responsible." Hamish approached with a mild expression, hands in his pockets as if he had all the time in the world. "Responsible for what, sir?" "For agitating the victim," Blair said triumphantly. "Provocation leading to collapse. Daviot likes the sound of it." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "And your evidence?" Blair puffed up. "They're foreigners." Hamish simply blinked, letting the silence sharpen like the edge of a spade. Villagers shifted uneasily. Anderson coughed. Blair's voice faltered. And their tyres were muddy. "As they would be," Hamish said, "given the state of the roads." Blair sputtered, face reddening. "You watch yourself, Macbeth." "Aye, sir." Hamish's calm tone irked Blair more than any argument. The inspector stomped off, muttering about paperwork and incompetence. Villagers quickly drifted back to their errands. Hamish wandered toward Patel's shop, lugs at his heels, the wooden box heavy against his ribcage beneath the coat. At the door, Patel leaned out, lowering his voice. "Hamish, I heard Blair telling Mrs. Curry he'd solved the case. You'd think he'd found the crown jewels." "Aye, well, Blair likes tidy endings." Patel's eyes narrowed. "Angus never had a tidy life." Hamish nodded. "No, and he didn't have a tidy death." He walked toward the jetty, the lock stretching before him like a sheet of dull glass. The wind had returned, colder than before. Luggs sniffed the boards, then trotted ahead to the edge where a loose rope slapped rhythmically against a cleat. Hamish stood there a long moment, listening to the creak of wood, the hush of water, the thrum of something unsettled beneath the surface of the village. Angus had been pressured, perhaps blackmailed, perhaps haunted by debts he'd never paid, but there were no signs of a struggle, no violence, only fear woven through his last days. Fear could kill a man as surely as any blow. Thunder growled somewhere behind the hills. The wind shifted sharply. By late afternoon, the storm had surged back in earnest. Rain lashed the station windows as Hamish approached. Sonsie paced outside in narrow circles, fur slick, tail low, pausing now and then to stare into the trees behind the building. Every so often he hissed as though something unseen brushed the edge of his senses. Hamish crouched, attempting once more to coax him inside. "Come on then, it's miserable out here." But Sonsie backed away, eyes wide, locked on a patch of ground Hamish himself had begun to avoid, without understanding why. The same place where footprints had appeared days earlier. Luggs whined softly. The wind pressed against the station door. Hamish straightened, feeling a prickling awareness along his spine. Something was moving through Loch Dubh, quiet, patient, persistent, no longer hiding well. He stood with Luggs close beside him, the rain thickening to a steady curtain. Whatever Angus had feared had not died with him, and Hamish felt it drawing nearer. The storm had passed by morning, but it had left behind a world washed pale and thin, as though Loch Dubh had been wrung out and left to dry on the moors. Mist clung low to the grass, drifting in soft patches that moved like quiet ghosts along the shoreline. Hamish Macbeth sat inside the police station with a lantern burning on the desk, the dim light flickering against the damp walls. The electricity had cut out again sometime near dawn, leaving the village dependent on candles and whatever matches folk hadn't used during the night's tempest. Hamish preferred it this way. Darkness softened the world. The glow of a lantern suited him more than any harsh fluorescent light Strathbane could offer. It suited his thoughts as well, thoughts that were slow, careful, shaped by the facts he had collected and the truths villagers tried so hard to hide. On his desk lay the torn notebook page he'd taken from Angus's stash, creased now, but still jagged with fear. Hamish read them again, smoothing the creases with long, thin fingers. The handwriting still looked jagged, as though Angus had been writing with a hand that trembled. The Watcher was here again. Saw him near the burn. I cannae pretend no more. I've watched him too. If I ken where he is, maybe I can keep ahead of him. Hamish rubbed his chin. Watcher had sounded singular when he first read it. But now, in the stillness of morning, he saw the shape of a different pattern emerging, something more muddled. Angus had believed someone was watching him, but Angus had also been watching someone. Fear and suspicion often tangled in the minds of lonely men. Luggs lifted his head from the hearthrug, ears twitching toward the window. Sonsie, who had finally slunk into the station before dawn, perched on the highest shelf like a brooding ornament, eyes half-lidded but alert. Hamish pushed the notebook aside and rose to fetch more candles. The faint smell of damp peat, cold stone and wet wool filled the room. When he returned to his chair, he stared again at the scattered pages. Something was missing, something the old crofter hadn't intended anyone to find. Hamish stood abruptly. "Come on, lad," he said to Luggs. "We're heading to the croft." The walk to Angus's place took him across the moors, where the mist curled in low ribbons around his boots. The ground was soft from the night's downpour, and Hamish had to pick his way carefully over patches of slick stone. Luggs trotted ahead, pausing now and then to sniff the air with a faint whine. The dog had been uneasy for days. Hamish trusted that unease more than any statement Blair had ever taken. When the croft came into view, it looked no better than it had on his last visit. Roof dripping, windows dull, that same reek of damp and scorched kettle clinging to the place. Hamish set the lantern on the table and surveyed the room. He let his eyes drift over every object with patient attention. Angus had been a man of habits, untidy ones but predictable. For him to hide anything, it would have been somewhere quiet, somewhere he believed safe. Hamish's gaze fell to a floorboard slightly raised at the corner near the bed. He crouched and pressed it lightly. It shifted. "That'll be it," he murmured. With gentle pressure, he lifted the board. Beneath lay a narrow space filled with dust and a few mouse droppings, and a folded letter, blotted, damp, addressed in Angus's rough handwriting. To Reverend McPhee Hamish, unfolded it carefully. "Reverend, I dinna expect forgiveness, but I canna keep the truth alone any longer. The Inverness man is coming. He must be. I saw him near the loch, but that's not the worst of it. It's the thing I did, the money I took. I thought he'd let it go after all these years, but he wants something more. He wants the truth out, and I canna face it. If he doesn't kill me, my own fear will. Pray for my soul, for I have lost my way entirely." The signature was smudged as though Angus had tried to write it while his hand shook. Hamish sat back on his heels. "So that's it," he whispered. Angus had been frightened long before any stranger set foot in Loch Dubh. He'd been expecting ghosts, real or imagined. He returned the board to its place and left the croft. The mist had thickened, drifting in slow waves across the moor. Hamish walked toward the village with his mind ticking quietly. Angus had stolen something from Muir. Money, perhaps, long ago. But Angus mentioned a truth coming out. A secret heavier than money. In the village square, a few folk lingered around Patel's shop, despite the early hour. Patel spotted Hamish and waved him over, eyes wide with excitement and nerves. "Hamish, you heard what the Curry sisters saw last night." Hamish suppressed a sigh. "What is it this time?" "They said they saw a lantern near the loch before the storm hit. Someone walking slow-like. It frightened them half to death." "It could have been anyone." "Aye, but they insist it wasn't anyone from Loch Dubh." Hamish gave a small nod. The image of a lantern moving through mist, Angus's fear of being watched, something about it slid neatly into place. He found Gavin Muir standing under the hotel awning, smoking a cigarette as though trying to look like he belonged there. His hair was damp, his coat still too clean. When Hamish approached, Muir stiffened. "Constable," he said, "come to accuse me again." "I'm not accusing you," Hamish said quietly, "but I've some more questions." Muir sighed heavily, flicking ash into a puddle. "Make them quick." "Angus wrote about a debt. He said he took something from you." Muir's jaw tightened. "Money. A lot of it. I loaned it to him when we were young. Foolish of me. He vanished before I could get even a word of thanks." "You wanted the wooden box back?" "Yes," Muir snapped. "It belonged to our uncle. Angus took that too." "Did you confront him?" Muir hesitated. "Aye. 2 nights before he died. He looked sick, jittery, sweating, barely able to stand. I told him I wanted the box, nothing more. He said he didn't have it anymore." Hamish's brow creased. "Did he say who did?" "No. He only mumbled that the other man would come for it." Muir's voice softened. "I didn't harm him, Constable. I only wanted the past settled." Hamish believed him. Not fully, but enough. A soft growl rose beside him. Luggs stepped forward, ears pricked, staring toward the back of the hotel, where a narrow lane curved around the building. Hamish turned. Footsteps. Soft, quick, retreating. Someone had been listening. He moved a few steps toward the lane, but the mist swallowed the figure before Hamish saw more than a shape shifting into grey. Lugs barked once, sharp and warning. Sonsie, who had followed silently from the station, arched his back and hissed. Hamish stood still, listening, his heartbeat steady despite the tension. There was someone hiding in Lockdub, someone moving carefully through the edges of the village, someone not Muir, someone Angus had feared, and now that someone was listening at windows and doorways. Hamish let out a slow breath. "Come on, lad," he murmured to Lugs. "We're closer now." And the mist tightened around them, as though the village itself leaned in to hear the next whisper of truth waiting beneath its quiet surface. The moor looked different after rain, darker, heavier, the heather beaten flat in patches as though something large had passed through during the night. Hamish Macbeth stepped outside the station at first light, breathing in the cold morning air that carried the tang of wet earth and peat smoke drifting from half-awake homes. Lugs padded out with him, shaking droplets from his coat before fixing his gaze toward the hills. Sonsie sat on the doorstep, tail wrapped tight, watching the moor with narrowed, unblinking eyes. Hamish rubbed the dog's ears absently, his mind on the footsteps from the night before. Someone had been listening outside the hotel, someone who moved like a shadow through fog, and now, with the ground still soaked, they might have left traces. He barely had time to consider a plan before a voice cut through the morning silence. "Constable Macbeth! Hamish!" Mrs. Morrison hurried toward him, her shopping basket swinging wildly, her hair pinned in curling metal clips that rattled with every step. She was breathless by the time she reached him. "Someone was running up toward the moor earlier," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "Fast, too. Looked like he didn't want anyone seeing him." Hamish lifted a brow. "Did you recognize him?" "No, but he had a coat like the minister's, dark, short, and he moved like a frightened rabbit." Hamish thanked her gently. Mrs. Morrison bustled off, muttering about strange goings-on and the lack of proper manners in modern times. Hamish looked down at Lugs. "Let's see, then." The dog was already moving. Hamish followed Lugs up the slope leading toward the moor. The grass flattened where someone had recently run. Rain began again, not a storm this time, but a steady drizzle that blurred the edges of things and made the rocks slick. The scent of wet heather rose around them. Hamish felt the familiar steadiness that came when walking the moors, the quiet that helped him think despite the cold trickling down his collar. They climbed higher, the mist growing thicker until the village below disappeared. Lugs paused near an outcrop of rock, ears pricked forward. Hamish stepped carefully around a patch of slick mud, only to have his boots skid on a smooth stone. He caught himself with one hand against the outcrop, his heart jolting. "Steady," he muttered, annoyed at himself. Cozy danger or no, he had no wish to tumble down the slope. Just then a shadow moved in the corner of his eye, the quick, darting movement of someone startled. Hamish turned sharply. A figure bolted through the mist. Hamish didn't run often, but when he did, he ran efficiently, long strides, quiet breath. He followed the shape through the fog, Lugs bounding ahead with excited barks that echoed strangely across the rocks. "Stop!" Hamish called, though he kept his tone mild, not commanding. People responded better to calm. The figure stumbled near a dip in the ground, arms flailing before regaining balance. Hamish quickened his pace, his boots splashed through shallow puddles, the mist thinned just enough for recognition. Reverend McPhee. Hamish slowed but did not stop. "Reverend!" McPhee froze, chest rising in sharp, frightened breaths. His spectacles were fogged and his usual mild expression was replaced with something wild-eyed. "Constable! Hamish! This isn't— What are you doing up here?" Hamish asked quietly, stepping closer. Lugs circled around the minister, sniffing him with sharp curiosity. McPhee swallowed hard. Rain trickled down his nose. "I thought I saw someone. Last night. A shape near the kirk. And this morning, I thought—" He pressed his hands together as if in prayer. "I thought it might be him again." "Who?" Hamish pressed gently. McPhee hesitated. His shoulders sagged. "Angus came to me. You know that. He told me things, terrible things, about when he lived in Inverness. Things he'd done that shamed him." The Reverend's voice cracked slightly. "He wronged a woman there, Hamish. A young woman. Badly." Hamish let the silence settle. McPhee wiped rain from his glasses with trembling fingers. He said someone wanted him to pay for it. A relative of hers, maybe. or someone connected to that man Muir. Angus was never precise in his confession. He feared everyone, everything. Hamish nodded. Did he ever say someone threatened him? No, but he said the past had come back, and he was terrified. McPhee shuddered. I heard Gavin Muir was in the village. I thought the worst. Hamish felt the pieces slide together, not sharply, not with triumph, but with quiet inevitability. Reverend, Angus died of fright. That's clear enough now. No wounds, no signs of a struggle, just panic. Something startled him near the kirk, and his heart couldn't take it. McPhee's shoulders drooped fully now, deflating like an old bellows. I thought someone was coming for me, he whispered. I thought whoever haunted Angus might haunt the rest of us. Hamish gave him a gentle look, the kind of look that villagers trusted more than any reassurance Blair could offer. You're not in danger, Reverend. McPhee tried to step past him, but in his anxiety, he moved too quickly. His boots slipped on the slick rock. Hamish grabbed his arm instinctively, but the minister lurched sideways, nearly sending them both over a low ridge. Lugs barked sharply. Hamish dug his heels in and pulled the Reverend upright. Careful, he said, voice steady. The Moor won't forgive a misstep today. McPhee nodded, still shaking. Forgive me. My nerves. They're ruined. Hamish escorted him down the slope, lugs guarding one side as if shepherding a wayward sheep. By the time they reached level ground again, the rain had eased to a soft patter. The village emerged slowly through the mist, roofs shining with moisture, chimneys puffing weak morning smoke. At the foot of the hill, Reverend McPhee paused. Hamish, what will you do now? Hamish considered. Speak to Muir again, and the villagers. There's still more fear than truth going around. McPhee nodded weakly and hurried off toward the kirk, shoulders hunched. Hamish watched him go, feeling the weight of things settle into their proper shapes. Angus had been cornered, not by a killer, but by the long shadow of his own guilt. Muir's lantern in the dark, old wrongs, old debts, panic sharp enough to stop a heart already worn thin. Still, as Hamish walked toward the station, he couldn't shake the sense that some villagers knew more. Their glances had been too sharp, their whispers too controlled. Loch-Dubh had a way of hiding truths until the moment they mattered most. Back at the station, Sonsie paced anxiously along the doorstep, tail low, ears flattened. Lugs growled softly, nose lifted toward the trees behind the building. Hamish frowned. What now? The wind shifted. Something rustled in the undergrowth, soft, deliberate, fleeting. Not a storm, not imagination, just movement, quick and sneaking, like someone avoiding questions rather than making threats. Hamish rested a hand on Lugs's head, steady and calm. Aye, he murmured, eyes narrowing at the shifting leaves. I ken you're there. The Moor answered only with cold silence, but the next step in the mystery waited just beyond it. The storm eased just after midday, leaving Loch-Dubh wrapped in a damp stillness that felt as fragile as spun glass. Mist clung stubbornly to the hills, drifting down in soft veils that settled along the cottages and seeped into every stone crack. Hamish Macbeth walked slowly toward the kirk hall, Lugs close at his heel, the dog's ears pricked as if the village itself were holding its breath. Sonsie followed at a distance, tail sweeping in wary arcs, no longer staring fixedly at the tree line, but not quite at ease either. Hamish's long stride was unhurried, despite what awaited inside. He had gathered the villagers, not by demand, but by quiet invitation. A few words here, a nod there, the sort of gentle insistence Loch-Dubh respected. They had come because Hamish asked, and because they were tired of whispers hanging like cobwebs across the village. He paused outside the kirk hall, listening to the murmur of voices within, the creak of old floorboards, chairs scraping. The village was restless. Fear always chipped away at civility, and Loch-Dubh was no exception. He pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the hall smelled of damp coats, wet wool, and the faint lingering scent of scones from some earlier gathering. The crofters sat in one corner, caps in hands. The Curry sisters perched stiffly in the front row. Mrs. Morrison clutched her basket as if afraid someone might rifle through it. Ewan Fraser, freed from Blair's blundering arrest, sat awkwardly near the back. The tourist couple huddled together, nervous but determined to appear blameless. Gavin Muir stood alone by the wall, shoulders drawn tight, hands clasped behind him in an effort to look composed. Reverend McPhee hovered near the front, wringing his hands as though in silent prayer. And Blair, of course, loomed near the lectern, red-faced and scowling, clearly irritated that Hamish had gathered his villagers without consulting him. Anderson stood at his side, dutifully nodding at whatever Blair said, no matter how unreasonable. Hamish stepped forward, hands in his pockets. Luggs trotted ahead and sat by his feet, watching the room carefully. Sonsie slipped in behind them, to the surprise of several villagers, and settled near the stove with a low, contented rumble. Hamish cleared his throat, softly. The room stilled. "Thank you all for coming," he said, voice quiet but carrying. "I thought it best we speak plainly. Angus Meldrum's death has stirred a fair amount of fear, and fear, as we've all seen, tends to do more harm than the truth itself." Blair snorted loudly. "Aye, well, since you've insisted on this nonsense, Macbeth, do hurry it along. Some of us have real policing to do." Hamish gave him a mild look. "Aye, sir, I'll keep it simple." The villagers leaned forward. Hamish began slowly, walking a few steps across the front, as was his habit when thinking aloud. Angus came back from Inverness years ago carrying something more than a suitcase. He carried guilt, and he carried fear. He wronged folk there, folk he never made peace with. Reverend McPhee shifted uncomfortably. Hamish continued. He took money from Gavin Muir, stole it in fact, and he carried that guilt with him every day after. Muir closed his eyes briefly, jaw tightening. The villagers murmured. But Angus also believed he was being watched. He convinced himself that the past was coming back for him, that someone wanted revenge. "Someone was watching him," Mrs. Morrison whispered. "The lantern." Hamish shook his head gently. "No, that's where things got twisted. Angus saw someone with a lantern near the loch, but the truth is simpler and more human." He turned to Muir. "Gavin Muir came to Loch Dubh for closure, not revenge." Muir straightened, swallowing hard. "I only wanted the photograph," he said quietly. "The one of us when we were young. My mother. She wanted it before she died." Hamish nodded. "Aye, the wooden box Angus hid contained nothing but that photograph. Angus thought Muir wanted more. Thought he wanted to expose some old shame. But the only thing Gavin wanted was a reminder of what they were, before everything fell apart." A hush settled in the room. "And Angus," Hamish added softly, "had been watching Gavin too, seeing enemies where there were none." Morag MacIver raised a trembling hand. "But the shouting, the argument by the pens—" "Aye," Hamish said. "Angus panicked when Gavin confronted him, but Gavin left him alive. Angus admitted as much to Reverend McPhee." All eyes turned to the minister, who gave a small, pained nod. "He came to me," McPhee said, "confessed his fears, asked for guidance. I didn't know how to help him. He was a man unravelling." McPhee's voice wavered, and Hamish spared him further embarrassment by stepping in. "The night he died," Hamish said, "Angus saw Gavin's lantern down by the loch. Angus bolted, panicked, and by the time he reached the kirk wall he was done for. No struggle, no blows. Just fear big enough to stop a heart that was already worn thin." A ripple of sympathy passed through the hall. Even those who disliked Angus Meldrum looked briefly chastened. Mrs. Curry sniffed. "So there's no murderer at all?" "No," Hamish said gently. "Only a frightened man, shadows made large by guilt, and a village caught in the echoes of his fear." Blair's face purpled. "This is ridiculous. A perfectly good arrest." "No arrest," Hamish said calmly. "No crime. And the tourists can go on their way. They did nothing wrong." Anderson tugged Blair's sleeve in a meek attempt at discreetness. "Sir, Daviot might—" "Shut up, Anderson," Blair growled. The villagers exchanged looks, some amused, some weary. Patel coughed into his hand to hide a smile. Hamish let the room settle before continuing in his steady, understated way. "We can put this behind us now, but let's remember Angus wasn't a villain, nor was he a saint. He was just a man who made mistakes and never found the courage to set them right." For a moment, the hall was silent, except for the faint hiss of the stove and the creaking of old wooden beams. Then villagers began to rise, murmuring thanks. Mrs. Morrison squeezed Hamish's arm. The Curry sisters nodded stiffly, which was as close as they came to praise. Ewan shuffled over to thank him with shy gratitude. Even Morag paused at the door, eyes softer than before. "You did right by him," she said quietly. even now. Hamish gave her a small, sad smile. Folk deserve the truth, even if it's not the one they expect. One by one, the villagers drifted out into the damp afternoon, their voices fading as they walked home through lingering mist. Blair stormed off without a word, Anderson trailing behind like a chastised pup. Muir thanked Hamish quietly, shoulders less rigid now, before heading back to pack his things for the journey south. When the hall was nearly empty, Hamish lingered near the stove. Sonsie padded over, slowly, cautiously, and for the first time since Angus's death, the cat slipped indoors without protest. He curled up near the stove, eyes half closed. Hamish watched him with a weary fondness. "You're a strange one," he murmured, "but you ken more than most." Luggs lay beside the cat, giving a soft sigh as he rested his head on his paws. Hamish stepped outside, closing the Kirk Hall door behind him. The mist had thinned, soft light falling across the loch like a veil. The quiet was almost comforting. He stood there a long moment, tall and solitary, hands deep in his pockets. The village was safe again, for now, but Loch Dubh always held more shadows waiting to stir. As he turned toward the station, that familiar ache settled in, the quiet loneliness he carried like a second skin. Luggs barked once, softly, as though reminding him he wasn't entirely alone. Hamish nodded. "Aye, lad, let's go home." The mist followed him, gentle and unhurried, as the village breathed out at last. Snow began just after dusk, fine, hesitant flakes that drifted down through the still air, as though Loch Dubh had finally taken a long breath after days of fretful weather. Hamish Macbeth stood on the loch path with Luggs beside him, the dog's breath puffing in soft white clouds. The world had gone quiet in that way only snow could manage, muting sound, smoothing sharp edges, and softening the lingering tensions that clung to the village. Hamish watched the flakes land on the dark waters of the loch, melting as soon as they touched. He pulled his collar up against the bite in the air. The path was firm beneath his boots, but fresh snow was already gathering in the dips and hollows, frosting the heather. Above him, the hills crouched under veils of white, barely visible through the faint light of an early winter moon. Luggs nudged his leg gently, sensing a mood in Hamish that words never quite captured. "Aye, lad," Hamish murmured. "It's been a trying few days." His voice drifted across the still water, swallowed almost instantly by the snow. He walked a few more steps, boots crunching softly, mind turning in its slow, steady way. Angus Meldrum's death had settled like a bruise on the village, dark at first, tender to the touch, then slowly fading as truth replaced fear. But guilt had its own strange life. It lingered in corners long after everyone else had moved on. Hamish had known men like Angus, proud, stubborn, unable to face their own mistakes. He'd known others like Muir, quietly seeking closure, too late to change anything. And he'd known villages like Loch Dubh, full of folk who smiled kindly even while hoarding old grudges like precious coins. Life here was a muddle of kindness, jealousy, gossip, and loyalty. Hamish walked through it all, tall and solitary, always on the edge of belonging and not belonging. He paused at the jetty. Snow rested lightly on the wooden planks, muting the usual creak of boards and muffle of water. The lamp above the jetty flickered once, twice, then held steady. Hamish leaned an elbow on the railing. "I sometimes wonder," he said quietly, "if some folk ken how to let go of their past better than others." Luggs pressed against his leg, warm and solid. Hamish gave the dog's head a slow stroke. The flakes grew thicker, drifting down like feathers shaken from some great pillow in the clouds. The air smelled of cold stone and distant peat smoke, comforting smells, the kind Hamish never wanted to lose. He'd lived among them too long to imagine any other life. He turned back toward the station, walking through the whitening village. Windows glowed softly behind frosted panes. Curtains flicked as curious eyes followed his path. Someone, the Curry sisters no doubt, shut their door with abrupt delicacy as he passed. Patel's shop was dark now, but a small lantern flickered in the window, a sign he was still awake inside, reading perhaps or making lists of supplies. "Folk can sleep easier now," Hamish said under his breath, brushing snow from his coat sleeve. He reached the station and pushed open the door, greeting the familiar scent of damp wool, old paperwork, and the lingering hint of tea. Sonsie sat curled by the hearth as if he had lived there all his life, his fur catching the firelight in copper glints. The cat lifted his head at Hamish's entrance but did not move away, a soft sign of approval, or at least acceptance. Hamish hung his damp coat on the peg and gave the peat fire a gentle nudge with the poker. Sparks drifted upward like tiny fireflies before disappearing into the dim chimney. He added another piece of peat, feeling the warmth begin to seep into his hands. "A wee bit better," he murmured. Lugs padded to his blanket near the hearth, circled once and lay down with a sigh. Sonsie shifted closer, his tail flicking lazily before settling. In the corner, the telephone rang sharply. Hamish didn't move. It rang again, insistent, shrill, and familiar in its irritation. Only one man used the phone with that particular kind of fury. On the fourth ring, Hamish reached over and gently took the receiver off the hook, placing it beside the cradle without answering. The silence that followed felt like a blessing. He poured a cup of tea from the kettle he'd left warming on the hob. The steam curled up, carrying the faint, comforting scent of strong black tea. Hamish lowered himself into his chair, letting the warmth seep through his cold fingers. A small envelope lay on the table beside the lamp. He'd found it earlier in the postbox. Priscilla's handwriting on the front, restrained and elegant. He picked it up again and opened it, reading the brief message for a third time. "Hamish, I heard there was trouble in the village. I hope you are well. London is hectic, as ever, but I think of Lochdubb often. Do take care of yourself. P." It was a kind note. It was a distant note. It was exactly the sort of note Priscilla Halberton Smythe always sent, polite, thoughtful, and wrapped in that unbridgeable space between her world and his. Hamish folded it carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. "She's kind," he said aloud, watching the fire through lowered lashes. "And far away, always far away." Lugs lifted his head and nuzzled Hamish's knee. Sonsie purred, a quiet rumble like distant thunder. Hamish leaned back in his chair, feeling the loneliness slide in with its familiar weight. Not unwelcome, not painful, simply part of him. A man couldn't live in Lochdubb as long as he had without forming a sort of truce with solitude. It kept him steady. It let him listen. It gave him room to think the way he needed to think. He gazed into the fire. The peat glowed orange and red, shifting slowly as it burned. The room was warm, the kind of warmth that came not only from heat, but from calm after a storm, literal and otherwise. The crackle of burning peat was the only sound. "It's enough," he said softly. He didn't know if he meant the room, the solved mystery, the villagers settling again into their grudges and kindnesses, or the way Sonsie finally felt safe enough to sleep by the hearth. Perhaps he meant all of it. Outside, snow continued to fall, not in a storm but in a quiet, steady drift that blanketed the village in white. Footsteps outside would vanish in minutes. Voices would be hushed. The world, for tonight at least, belonged to stillness. Hamish placed a hand on Lugs's head and closed his eyes for a moment. The dog shifted closer. Sonsie curled tighter, his fur warm against the rug. Hamish let out a long, slow breath, the kind that released something deep inside. Another mystery resolved. Another long week behind him. Another night in Lochdubb, with the snow falling soft as feathers and the fire whispering its quiet reassurance. Life wouldn't change much. He wouldn't seek promotion. He wouldn't leave. He never would. The village might vex him, worry him, warm him, frustrate him, but it was his. More than that, he belonged to it in some quiet, unspoken way. Hamish opened his eyes, watching the firelight dance over Lugs's fur, over Sonsie's whiskers, over the old station walls. "Aye," he murmured, "it's enough." The snow fell thicker, softening the windows, blurring the world beyond them into gentle white, and Hamish Macbeth sat before the fire, at peace in his own quiet, solitary way.